Hey everyone, this is Andy Melbuff, and in this video we're going to take a look at how we can limit the number of times a student presses a button in Decimos Activity Builder by adding some computation layer into the background. In math education, we oftentimes think it's great to be able to allow students to have more than one opportunity to answer a question, but sometimes how much is too much? Do we allow them to just guess their way through a question until they get the right piece of feedback? This particular question has some feedback built in, but I don't want the students to just guess all the different possible combinations until they see the correct piece of feedback. Well, let me show you what it looks like when they're allowed to guess. For example, if the student were to choose options 1 and 2 and press the Check My Answer button, they'll get a piece of feedback saying at least one of them is wrong. And on the teacher dashboard, we see an X here, meaning at least one is wrong. But the students can then do some checking, and they can just start going through all the possible scenarios in which they choose questions until they get the piece of feedback that shows this. Correct, nice work. So we can limit how many times this button is pressed and limit how the feedback shows up with a little computation layer in the background. Here's an example of a similar question with different checkbox options here for a student to answer, and we're going to have some feedback in here also, but this Check My Answer button is going to have a limit set to it. So if the student were to choose, let's say, the first two options, and they press Check My Answer, they'll get a piece of feedback saying it's incorrect. Now, if they keep going through this process and checking the button, you'll notice here the button gets disabled. By being disabled, it changes color from that brighter blue color to a grayed out color, and it's not accessible anymore. And also the label on the button has changed. It says, you've now tried this 3 times, you need to get some help. So let me show you how we can build this into the computation layer. I've got a note here with some computation layer in it for the feedback variable. I've got a checkbox here, and in the checkbox there are 6 possible options. So the correct answers are options 5 and 6 in there. And we're going to use that in our feedback variable. So let me show you how that looks. This feedback variable basically is going to explore conditions. An activity builder is going to check these conditions from the top down. So here's the first condition it's going to check. It's going to look to see if checkbox option number 5 is selected and checkbox number 6 is selected. Those are the correct answers we want. But we also want the other ones not selected. So we also build that into this here. We don't want to select options 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. And we also want the button to be pressed. So if all that occurs, here's the message the students get. Correct, nice work. If that doesn't happen, let's go down to the next option. Now we're going to set a condition for the button to check for a press count of 3. Once the button has been pressed 3 times, here's the message that's displayed. It's a double set of quotation marks, and there's nothing between them, meaning nothing will show up feedback-wise for the student once the button has been pressed 3 times. And in our third row here, once the press count is greater than 0, meaning the button has been pressed at least once and it's been pressed 3 times or less, they get this piece of feedback. So let's see how we can tie that in here down with the button and look at how to disable the button. Now on this screen, I'm going to blow this up a little bit so it's a little easier to read. Anything again with a pound sign or hashtag symbol there is just a message. It's a note to myself or to you. So I use this to help stay organized. The first thing of these 3 pieces we're going to look at is the stop variable. Now I use stop as a variable, and it's going to be equal to whatever this component's press count is. So once the student presses the button 1 time, stop takes on a value of 1. When the student presses it a second time, stop takes on a value of 2. So we want to disable this button. This is a sync. Notice the color and a colon after it. We're going to disable this component, this button, once the press count gets to 3. And also the button label I like to play with also. The label is what the students see on the button. The label has 2 conditions to it. When the stop variable, which is tied to the press count, is less than 3, the student sees check my answer. But once it becomes 3 or higher, they get this message. You've tried this 3 times, ask your teacher for help, and the button also will be disabled at this point. We can also limit student submissions on components that don't involve an action button, but instead have a submit button. So what you're seeing here is a simple question that says how many degrees in a triangle, and here's a math input button, and it's already got a submit button with it. Now I've changed the label. I'll show you that in a moment. This normally says submit, so I don't need to add an action button to this. If a student were to guess, I'm just going to make up some random numbers here. If they guess 100 and click how did I do, well, I didn't put any feedback in this, okay, but that's clearly a wrong answer. If they were to choose 120 and click the button a second time, again, I don't have any feedback in there. And if they press the button a third time, watch what happens when I press the button a third time. Another note comes up that says, it looks like you're guessing, ask for help. Okay. And if the student were to try to change their recent response from 800 to anything else, notice this submit button has been disabled. I've not changed the label on it because I put my message in a note down here. So let me show you how this looks in the computation layer. I've got a note component on top right here. I've got a math input button right below it, and I've got a second note below the input. So let's jump into the input computation layer. And now, rather than, this has a different sync to it. We use, for math input, we use submit disabled. And that basically says we're going to disable this submit button with the following condition here. When this component's submit count equals 3. Notice it's not press count anymore because it's not called an action button. Press count only works with an action button. For a submit button, we have to use submit count. So when that hits 3, this submit button will be disabled. And I've also adjusted what I want the submit label to show. I want it to show how did I do. But this note component on the bottom, I only want to show up once that submit button has been disabled. So let me show you what's in here. I'm going to keep this hidden. This is the hidden sync. It's going to be, this note is going to be hidden until, as long as the input component has a submit count of less than 3. Once it's 3 or higher, this note will show. So again, let's preview it one more time. I'm just going to put in 20, click the button a second time, click the button a third time, and you'll notice the button is now disabled and this note shows up. It's no longer hidden because the submit count is 3 or higher. So those are a couple of different options that a teacher can use in Computation Layer to limit the number of times a student presses a button.